Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. You know, way back in episode 1, I talked about Beach Boy music from different eras that I love. And I mentioned that I couldn't really come up with anything that I loved from the Beach Boys in the 1990s. And I asked, really, was there any music from the 1990s from the Beach Boys that was worth loving? Happily, I got a lot of responses, and I thank you for that. And while everybody kind of agreed that the 90s was certainly not a prime time for the Beach Boys by any means, there did seem to emerge a general consensus that probably the best of the 90s was Brian Wilson's solo album, Imagination, released June 16, 1998. Now today I'd like to talk about this album in depth, but before I do that, I'd like to give a little background and kind of get back in the mind of what things were like in 1998, particularly in regards to Brian Wilson. Now, as we know, Brian Wilson had released his first solo album back in 1988 to great acclaim. It was a great album. But since then, we had heard very, very little from him. He had released songs as B-sides of some singles from the album. He had done some cover versions for tribute albums during that time. He had appeared as a guest vocalist for some projects and had done live versions or re-recordings of some of his earlier work. We also knew that Brian had written and recorded a number of songs that hadn't been released. But as far as released Brian Wilson written songs performed by Brian Wilson in that 10 years between 1988 and 1998, apart from those B-sides that I mentioned earlier, I can only think of In My Car from the Still Cruisin' album, Daddy's Little Girl from the She's Out of Control soundtrack, Country Feelin's from the Disney charity album For Our Children, Fantasy is Reality, Bells of Madness from Rob Wasserman's Trios album, In My Moon Dreams from the compilation Pulp Surfin', the German-only B-side, This Song Wants to Sleep With You Tonight from the Do It Again single, This Isn't Love from the Windham Hill compilation Songs Without Words, and Everything I Need from the Wilsons album. Oh yes, and I nearly forgot to mention there was the Barbie Flexadisc from the 1988 California Dream Barbie. But this is 9 tracks in 10 years, certainly not very prolific. And it was beginning to look as if Brian Wilson, like Dennis, was going to produce one great solo album, and that was going to be it. So it was kind of a surprise when it was announced that there would be a new Brian Wilson solo album in 1998. And even then, my suspicion was this might be a whole bunch of different versions of things that sound like shortening bread. So imagine my delight when we got the Imagination CD released in June of 1998. Now, right around the same time as this, there were 2 promotional discs released, which I wanted to mention because I'm going to talk about them quite a bit. There was the Preview of Imagination disc from an interview by Peter Buck of REM, featured in the June 1998 issue of the British music magazine Mojo. It has 10 interview excerpts, mostly between 30 seconds and 1 minute, intercut with tracks from the album. In the interview, Peter Buck says that he listened to Imagination on the way to the interview and that he particularly likes the first track, Imagination. Now, I know Peter Buck is a major Brian Wilson fan, but I kind of get the feeling that he either hadn't listened to the album all the way through for some reason, or only had the chance to listen to it in the car right before the interview. The other interview disc is called Words and Music, which features excerpts of an interview that Brian did with Sean Lennon. It contains interview clips and excerpts from 6 of the album's songs, though 2 of them, South American Happy Days, used the same sound clip from the Peter Buck interview. This disc also includes a live vocal and acoustic guitar version of In My Room featuring, according to the back cover, Bruce Johnston, Timothy B. Schmidt, Christopher Cross, and Jim Petterick. I believe this is the only place that that particular live track has been released. Brian says in the Words and Music interview right at the beginning that he's been told by people that this album will be a smash hit. What were the chances of that actually happening in 1998? Let's look briefly at what the top albums were in June of 1998 when the Imagination album was released. At number 1, you had the City of Angels soundtrack from the Warner Brothers film starring Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan. It featured Alanis Morissette's Uninvited and the Goo Goo Dolls' Iris. Both of these artists had new albums coming out on Warner's later in the year, and the tracks included here served as teasers for those albums. Also, with few people buying singles anymore, and singles even hard to find, it was a great way to make Morissette and Goo Goo Dolls fans shell out for an entire album for one track by their favorite artist. At number 2, we had Godzilla, the album, the soundtrack from the first Godzilla film produced entirely by a Hollywood studio starring Matthew Broderick. Featured tracks were Come With Me by Puff Daddy featuring Jimmy Page, which went to number 4, Deeper Underground by Jamiroquai, which was a number 1 in the UK, and a cover of David Bowie's Heroes by the Wallflowers. With so many CDs on the market like this, featuring 1, maybe 2 tracks that a fan would actually want, it's not difficult to believe that people began thinking, maybe there should be a way to get just the track I want without having to buy the entire CD. Maybe there was some way the computer could help with this. At number 3 was It's Dark and Hell Is Hot, the debut album by DMX featuring Get At Me Dog, Rough Riders Anthem, and How's It Going Down. At number 4, The Limited Series by Garth Brooks, a reissue of his first 6 albums with bonus tracks. This was the first box set ever to debut at number 1. At number 5, Backstreet's Back. The Backstreet Boys with a US-only self-titled compilation album comprised of songs from their first 2 international albums. At number 6, the Dave Matthews Band's Before These Crowded Streets, their 3rd album and first number 1 featuring Don't Drink the Water, Stay, Wasting Time, and Crush. At number 7 was the self-titled album by R. Kelly protege Sparkle featuring the cut Be Careful. In the number 8 spot, songs from Ally McBeal, featuring the theme from the series, Searching My Soul, performed by Vonda Shepard, with the rest of the album mainly filled out by Vonda Shepard's cover versions of 60s hits. At number 9, Come On Over by SHANIA TWAIN, her 3rd studio album and her first number 1, featuring top 10 hits, You're Still the One, From This Moment On, and That Don't Impress Me Much. Rounding out the top 10 was the Titanic soundtrack, still hanging on in the top 10. It had spent 16 weeks at number 1 before the Dave Matthews Band had unseated it. It's mostly the orchestral score from the movie and features My Heart Will Go On, love theme from Titanic by Celine Dion. It was a huge hit and one of the biggest selling albums of all time, probably mainly down to the huge popularity of the film. So I remember back in '98 when I first heard this interview with Brian Wilson, I'm thinking, who's telling Brian Wilson this album is going to be a smash hit? I mean, if Brian had made the slam dunk greatest album of his career in 1998, I think it's unlikely he would have had a smash hit in that atmosphere. But maybe this was the intention. Maybe they really were trying to make a smash hit album in the adult-oriented rock style of 1998. Like 1985's Beach Boys album, much of the discussion around the Imagination album centers on its outside producer. In this case, Joe Thomas, who's credited as co-producer with Brian on the Imagination album. Brian says that Joe Thomas first came to their attention through Willie Nelson. Joe Thomas ended up with a co-producer credit, again with Brian, on the Beach Boys' Stars and Stripes Volume 1 album in 1996. According to Mike Love, the concept of the Beach Boys doing a country album came from Joe Thomas. Brian says they clicked right away, and he liked having someone to bounce ideas off in the studio. Much of the speculation and criticism at that time and since has centered around the shiny, sterile, modern adult contemporary production that Joe Thomas seemed to bring to the mix. Critics had called the production an attempt to make the album sound like everything else on the radio. In the Mojo interview, Brian Wilson says he wanted to make an album of commercial music plus appealing music. And maybe they really thought, with this kind of production, Imagination could be a smash hit album. Now, I remember when I first heard this album back in 1998. I wasn't enamored of the production, but I wasn't really put off by it either. It was actually pretty much what I expected from production in 1998. What I was much more excited about was the fact that this album contained some great songs and was a Brian Wilson album of original material that seemed to have a direction unlike pretty much anything else he had produced in the last 10 years. That meant much more to me than the production on this album. Let's talk about it track by track. The opening track, Your Imagination, is a Brian Wilson, Joe Thomas, Steve Dahl co-write. Steve Dahl being a Chicago-based radio personality and frequent associate of Joe Thomas. The opening line, another car running fast, another song on the beach, immediately and unnecessarily invokes the Beach Boys and is a self-referential move more suited to a Mike Love solo album. Fortunately, the melody of the verses is beautiful and builds nicely to the choruses. The sing-song structure of Your Imagination Runnin' Wild seems a little underdeveloped, but the vocals, all of which are provided by Brian here and on the rest of the album, are beautiful and largely make the chorus satisfying. Asked about the process of overdubbing all the vocals himself, Brian in the Mojo interview says he found it, not surprisingly, very tedious. The effort was worth it though, as the vocals here and throughout the album sound great. Brian says he thought he laid down some of the best vocals of his career on this album in the Words and Music interview, and I have to agree. Your Imagination ends with piccolo trumpet fanfares that are bound to make any music fan think of Penny Lane. It's really out of place here and a really odd choice. Still, Your Imagination is one of the best songs here and a real highlight of the set. Next up is another highlight, She Says That She Needs Me, which most Beach Boys fans know is from an unused 1965 Beach Boy track called Sherry, She Needs Me, with new lyrics by legendary lyricist-songwriter Carol Bayer Sager. Legendary producer-songwriter Russ Tiedemann is also credited, but I really don't know what he did. You can certainly hear the overtones of the 60s on this track, particularly in the chorus and the middle eight. The clarinets are beautiful, and I think the fact that it's a 60s track kind of made them temper the late 90s production and give it more of an homage to the 60s. The woodwinds and strings are particularly beautiful here, another real highlight of the set. Next up is South America, a Brian Wilson, Joe Thomas, Jimmy Buffett co-write that Brian says is his favorite track on the album. Apparently Brian and Joe Thomas created the backing track and sent it to Jimmy Buffett, who added the lyrics. Brian has high praise for Jimmy Buffett's words in both of the promotional interviews. In fact, they use the same sound clip in both promotional interviews. The theme is the usual getaway to a better place motif that Jimmy Buffett specializes in, but there are some clever rhymes. The track has some prominent percussion and some guitar and trumpet flourishes, though they fortunately resisted any attempt to turn the track into a pastiche of South American music. Maybe this is simply because it would have meant varying from the adult contemporary motif that they had going, but in any case, I'm glad they kept the South American flourishes subtle. Next up is Where Has Love Been, co-credited to Andy Paley and J.D. Souther. At first, this seems like it's going to be a soft Brian ballad, but it goes mid-tempo, and though there are some nice chord changes, it fails to make much of an overall impression. Then we have the first of two Beach Boys songs that Brian recut for the album. He says it was Joe Thomas's idea to cover them. They're kind of unnecessary, they can be looked at as filler, but Keep an Eye on Summer is undeniably a beautiful song. Brian's vocals are beautiful here. I also like some of the production. The guitar and violin and viola are particularly nice. The sixth track, Dream Angel, is probably the track most emblematic of the complaint that the production sounds like everything else that was going on at the time. The intro to this could have been on anybody's 1998 record, which to be fair means that this isn't just a problem with a Brian Wilson record. A lot of people were sounding like this in 1998, which is what makes the sound a cliche. There's a nice guitar solo, which offers a nice change from the other tracks on this album, except that it sounds like a guitar solo from a zillion other 1998 albums. Underneath is a pretty nice song with some really beautiful vocals, though in a few places they seem to have been filtered so much that they've just turned into a whooshing sound. In other parts of the song, Brian's vocals come through very beautifully. Next up we have Cry, which is another highlight from the album. This one seems to have some genuine emotion, which is lacking in other places on Imagination. Sean Lennon, talking about this track, observes that Brian has the ability to take a sad subject and make it more positive, which I think is one of the things that Brian really does well, and he does it here too. Real highlight of the record. I also like the Leave Her Alone backing vocal part. Following that, we have Lay Down Burden, which is my favorite track on the album, arguably the strongest thing here. This feels real and genuine, and the production doesn't overpower the work. A fully realized, moving, beautiful piece of music. This is just what we look for on a Brian Wilson album. I guess there is unquestionably something from the Beach Boys in the 1990s that I love. Next up, we have the second of the Beach Boy cover tracks, Let Him Run Wild. Again, it's a tune that is undeniable, so it's impossible not to enjoy it on some level. It feels a bit workmanlike and dispassionate. It's interesting to hear an updated version, but I'd just as soon hear a Brian Wilson live cut of the song. The penultimate track is Sunshine, which has a bit of a reggae feel, although they kept it pretty much in adult contemporary territory. There's just a few little reggae overtones to it. It's pleasant, forgettable. The sunshine refrain does get a little bit tedious. Partway through, there's a transition to a more piano-led part, which I much prefer. I like that much better. And it ends with a music box version of the theme, which kind of turns it into a mini medley. Reminds me a little bit in that second part of Rio Grande from the Brian Wilson album. The album ends with the song Happy Days, which Brian said was his favorite song to write and sing. And it draws on the unreleased 1970 Halloween composition My Solution. And of all the tracks for Brian Wilson to go back decades later and draw on, I can't figure out why he did this. I find it unpleasant and atonal. They've taken it and added it to an otherwise enjoyable composition. Brian says that the song explains how you go through dark periods and then find yourself in happy days. So I'm sure this is meant to represent the dark period, but I just assumed they'd done something more pleasant musically. So that pretty much does it for the tracks on Imagination. It wasn't a smash hit. It went to number 88 in the US, went to number 30 in the UK, so it wasn't a complete washout either. Brian, in his interview with Peter Buck, says he wants to do a hard rock album next. He's planning some TV appearances and video, but is definitive that there will be no tour. It was actually kind of hard to imagine that Brian Wilson would tour in those days. Surprisingly and happily, Brian did begin touring again the next year, and Brian Wilson's solo albums, some of which are excellent, became semi-regular events. Imagination is not Brian Wilson's greatest solo album, and I do agree that there are some problems with the production being sterile and seeming calculated for the adult contemporary market. But still, this is a much more cohesive album than we could have expected in 1998. It portended better things to come in the future. It has some very pleasant tracks on it. Brian's vocals are beautiful, and tracks like Your Imagination and Lay Down Burden are worthy additions to Brian's catalog of work. I wanted to thank everybody who wrote in on that first episode and suggested things from the 90s, particularly those of you who suggested Imagination, because it took me back to an album that I hadn't listened to in a while, and I really enjoyed getting acquainted with it again. Let me know what you think about this. Love to hear your comments. As always, please like and subscribe if you haven't. We'll see you next time. Bye.